Hello, and welcome to what I've chosen to call a history of rock and roll in film and rock and roll. You may call it what you like. This episode's been a long time coming, and it was one of the first I had the hankering to do when I first started researching episodes 2.5 years ago or more. It will be an intense one. There's going to be a lot of information about The Crow. There's going to be a lot of information about Joy Division. There's going to be a lot of information about Trent Reznor, 9 Inch Nails. There's going to be plenty to do with the making of the film in future episodes. As it stands right now, as I'm introducing this, I've recorded what I believe to be everything I'm going to do on the history of the music in question, and most of what I was going to record in terms of the story of James O'Barr, the creation of The Crow, the publication of it, and the release in various forms before the movie deal got signed, okay? That's going to be this episode. Now, after this episode, you're going to hear more about Joy Division, more about 9 Inch Nails that I've already recorded, just setting it aside. So this all isn't like a 9-hour episode by itself. But I don't know if once I finish fleshing out, that's fleshing, not flushing, out the story of the making of the film and the inevitable breakdown of what the hell happened on the set that led to the death of Brandon Lee. If you're at all a follower of that story, you probably know some of it. There was a lot that I thought I knew but didn't quite know, and there's a lot of detail that goes into what exactly the chain of events and the chain of command and the decisions that led to such a waste of an entire life of a young man that hadn't even hit 30 yet, hadn't even gotten the chance to marry his fiance yet, hadn't been able to start a family yet. That will be covered by the end of this, either 2-episode or 3-episode series. We're just going to have to wait and see what it takes. Now, if you're new to the show, this formula kind of changes from episode to episode, whether there's, more interesting stories about the film than there is about the artist or the band, or vice versa. In this case, I felt similar to how I felt about the AC/DC and Maximum Overdrive episodes that I did 3 of. This is pretty much equal, I'd say. There's just as much interesting stories about the Crow, the creation, the filming, the publication, as there is the stories of 9 Inch Nails and Joy Division. And if you don't know why I've picked this combination, it'll become clearer later on. Also, if you're new, I hope you enjoy this. I hope you appreciate the fact that there's no guests and there's no co-hosts. So that means you don't have to sit through me saying things like, "Hi, thank you so much for joining us," and then having to hear someone else say things like, "Well, thank you for having me." Yeah, of course. It's so awesome. It's so great. I mean that, I mean that with my whole heart. Like, what you're doing is so important. And tell the people out there, like, how you got started. How did you get involved in all this? Right? You don't have to sit through any of that bullshit. You don't have to, you don't have to sit here listening to me with a co-host that's not done the research that I've done and hear them react to it in real time, or just incessantly repeat things that I've already said, only louder, and maybe hear them cackle like a goddamn minor bird, laughing and making themselves laugh and just bust up all through the episode because they have nothing else to bring to the table. I may have been listening to a bit too many of other people's podcasts lately and noticed that we've just replaced terrestrial morning zoo radio with the same bullshit in a different package. I even tried listening to terrestrial radio for the first time in a billion years this week. It was not a pleasant experience. But what I hope is a pleasant experience for you is listening to me talk about all this stuff that I've researched, mixed in with a bunch of interstitial music that is comprised of a bunch of guitar demos that I've used to justify the gear that I own and the ideas that I come up with that I have been too lazy to hammer into actual songs and force my band members to learn the parts of. So you get them instead. And by being forced to listen to them, you justify my existence as a musician. And for that, I thank you. Let's fucking get on with it, shall we? Trent Reznor grew up in Mercer, Pennsylvania, which is out on the edges of what we would call the Rust Belt in America. When he graduated from the Mercer area junior-senior high school in 1983, a large contingent of his peer group was going to work nearby in a place called Sharon in one of the steel mills there. Those steel mills would be closed in 4 years. Trent, however, enrolled over in Allegheny College, which was a small liberal arts school up north of Mercer, and started work on courses in computer programming. This is 2 years after the IBM personal computer had been released or introduced to the public, and computer science departments in America, in American colleges, were just barely starting to spring up. Smaller schools like the one he was going to were focusing on practical job training, programming languages, and math fundamentals. When I was a little kid around this time, there'd be lots of daytime commercials. Every time you were homesick from school, watching Perry Mason and The Price is Right, waiting for cartoons to come on later in the day, you'd see a million commercials for ITT Technical Institute. And it was sort of a, hey, don't be stuck in the blue collar world that's shrinking. Get your ass to computer college. Come with us and train and learn how to program stuff. And they would present it as this this smart kid went to ITT Tech, and now he's making way more money than his older brother, kind of stuff. So after only about a year, I guess, Trent drops out. He'd met a girl. He was playing in this band called Option 30 and living among a peer group of passionate tech nerds, and he wasn't going back to his hometown for sure. And this boom in the, computer industry is having an effect on the music industry as well, obviously. It'd be a while before recording technology was heavily affected by these changes and would become, cheap enough and available enough to other people that normally couldn't afford to become a producer or a mixer. But it was the kind of thing that made electronic instruments less expensive and more innovative and easier for the average person to get their hands on during this time. And that's why you see a ton of new wave in 83 was already sort of, on its way out if you consider its beginnings in the late 70s, but, electro pop music was never going to go away from here on out in some form or another. I have to believe that a lot of keyboard-driven music was innovated and embraced by young artsy musicians in Europe this is all my speculation, but I assume there's a couple factors that made them better early adopters than the Americans. I mean, because the technology is coming from Japan, basically, right? So both communities, as it were, have equal access depending on money, but America has a strong insulated mentality of at this time of America first. You're still looked down on by certain people if you buy and drive a Japanese made car. There's still a lot of hatred left over from World War II. And also it's that, you're putting American workers out of business, not the Reagan administration. That has nothing to do with it. It's you for buying a Hyundai. Unless you think I'm politically biased in an anti-Republican way when it comes to the economy. I was a teenager when Bill Clinton was in office, and I fully blame that guy for all the evils wrought upon our world because of NAFTA and the amount of CEOs that folded up their American companies and moved them off to other countries while giving themselves huge raises and laying off all their American workers. Sorry to take that detour ideologically, but that's just why I just don't buy. The old messaging is very outdated when it comes to American Democrats being for big government and lots of regulations, and American Republicans being for smaller government. When in my young adulthood, we had the biggest overreach in power to take away our civil liberties from the Bush administration, the Patriot Act, and the biggest deregulation of American industries that led to massive layoffs of American workers from Bill Clinton. Anyhow, I'm sorry that I've kind of bounced away from the point here, but it's my show, and I'm processing my own feelings in real time. I was talking about Europe. Oh yeah. I have to believe that like all the crowded nature of city life in Europe led people to gravitate more toward playing synth pop, in their little apartments or wherever they could gather together for rehearsals, as with just showing up with a synthesizer under your arm and maybe a keyboard stand that you're going to plug into a sound system, as opposed to a Marshall stack, that's as tall as a refrigerator and very heavy and difficult to carry and incredibly loud and hard to control the volume. I think that there's also, just a general artsier, disco-oriented scene. There's a network of discotheques for young people to go to in Europe that didn't exist in America, especially, at a younger age than you could go to in America. And, live music venues for people to go to in their 20s were still, by and large, like, roadhouses and sports bar type stuff that are going to have top 40 musicians playing cover songs. And, classic rock by and large. I mean, you better be able to play Gimme 3 Steps by Lynyrd Skynyrd, which is an awesome song, by the way. I love Skynyrd's whole first album. It's perfect from front to back. And Europe has, so many other cultural influences that we don't have over here. Fashion moves quicker. The Depeche Mode, as they say, the fast fashion, and the hairstyles change quicker, and the trends move faster, and I think there's just a little more inclusiveness during the 80s when it comes to people dressing and dressing in ways that are a little less, they've already gone through the punk thing, but now it's time for the younger people, the next group of young folks, to start taking things in a different direction, still wild and outrageous, but a little bit less aggressive, I would say, more colorful, still wild colors of hair sticking straight up or poofing out or whatever, but things were getting a little more pop and new wavy and new romantic-y, that era. Men are, going for some looks that are more traditionally feminine and glamorous, as opposed to like spiky and, aggressive and, safety pins through the nose, etc. So during this time when synthesizers are changing, they're benefiting from the addition of microprocessors, which are getting more readily available and cheaper to install into musical instruments. And this leads to synthesizers going from monophonic to polyphonic and adding tone banks, memory banks and sampler functions inside them. So they've got their own hard drives now. They're not just push a button and it makes this noise and that's all you're going to get. It is like you can now digitally sample things. I'm assuming digitally. Maybe they're analog. I don't know. Sometimes I get confused. But, you can sample sounds and then play them back on any tone of the scale. And that's going to be a huge factor in how Trent Reznor is able to make Pretty Hate Machine all by himself. And I'll get into a couple specifics about those samples he used a little bit later. Some of them may surprise you. May make you go back to listen to Pretty Hate Machine again and then listen to Jane's Addiction's first album again. Shit, nothing shocking. Their first album was self-titled. Now to address the issue of Joy Division in this episode, I want to be clear and respectful to any Joy Division fans. I am learning the ins and outs of their history for the first time, and I am not prepared to do a deep dive on their entire, career, short as it was, because there's 2 other full-length films devoted to their existence. There's 24-Hour Party People, which was the first one that came out in, I think, the late 90s-ish, late 90s, early 2000s maybe at the latest. And then there's one devoted, I think, a lot more just to Ian Curtis called Control, which gets high marks from what I've seen online as far as music biopics go. And I chose them for The Crow because of the inspiration that they gave to James O'Barr, the creator of the Crow comic book, and the fact that Nine Inch Nails covered their song Dead Souls on the soundtrack, and it was featured prominently in the film. So I'm pulled in 2 directions. Like, it doesn't seem to be the right thing to do to focus on The Crow when talking about, when talking extensively about the band Joy Division, when there's 2 other movies about them out there. But it was my happiest thought when it came to what am I going to do musically with The Crow? Do I cover every band on the soundtrack, or what do I, and then when I learned more about the whole picture, how it was, how the inspiration came to James O'Barr, I felt like this might be the right way to go. So this will not be definitive as far as the story of Joy Division. Not that any episode I put out is the definitive story of anybody. But compared to like the many hours on AC/DC, or many hours on The Doors, things like that, it's not going to come close. But I think it will be what it needs to be. Because if you've seen Control and you've seen 24-Hour Party People, you probably love Joy Division to a level that vastly exceeds my knowledge or what I could pull together right now at this time. And I'm not going to teach you anything. So if you barely know about Joy Division, or you're barely aware that Nine Inch Nails song was a Joy Division song, or you didn't know it was a Joy Division song, then this one's for you when it comes to the Joy Division stuff, okay? How about that? Is that all right? Does that work? I think it will. So a guy named Peter Hook, who would become their bass player, and his good friend Barney, who would become their guitarist and keyboardist, went out to see the Sex Pistols one night because he had been reading the Manchester Evening News and saw some small ad that said at the Lesser Free Trade Hall for 50p a ticket, you can go see the Sex Pistols. So, he gets his only friends that'll go to the gig with him, Terry and Bernard, or Barney, because the rest of their friends are evidently very normal people that wouldn't be into that kind of thing. I'll tell a little bit from Hook's perspective. He phones Bernard up and says, "The Sex Pistols are on. Do you want to go and see them?" He went, "Who?" I said, "Oh, it's this group. They have fights at every gig, and it's really funny. Come on, it's only 50p. Yeah, all right then." Terry was up for it too, so it ended up being me, him, Barney, and Sue Barlow, who was Barney's fiancée. I think they met at Gresty's house when he was 16 or so. They had been going out for a few years and used to fight like cat and dog. With the possible exception of Debbie and Ian Curtis, future singer of Joy Division, they had the most tempestuous, argumentative relationship I've ever known in my life. And they ended up getting married. So that was it, anyway. The group of us who went and saw the Sex Pistols at Lesser Free Trade Hall. A night that turned out to be the most important of my life. Or one of them, at least. But that started out just like any other. Me and Terry making the trip in Terry's car. Barney and Sue arriving on his motorbike. The 4 of us meeting up and then ambling along to the ticket office. There to greet us was Malcolm McLaren, dressed head to toe in black leather jacket, leather trousers, leather boots, with a shock of bright orange hair, a manic grin, and the air of a circus ringmaster. Though there was hardly anyone else around. We were like, wow, he looks so wild, from another planet even. The 4 of us were in our normal gear, flared jeans, penny collars, velvet jackets with big lapels, all of that. Look at the photographs of the gig, and you can see that everybody in the audience was dressed the same way, like a Top of the Pops audience. There were no punks yet. So Malcolm, he looked like an alien to us. Thinking about it, he must have been the first punk I ever saw in the flesh. Wide-eyed, we paid him. Went in and down the stairs into the lesser free trade hall, the same stairs I'd laid down on many years before. At the back of the hall was a stage, and set out in front of it were chairs on either side of a central walkway, just like it was in 24-Hour Party People. Although I don't remember many people sitting down like they are in the film. I don't think there was a bar that night, so we just stood around waiting. He mentions the opening band. Mostly he remembers because they had done a note-for-note cover of Nantucket Sleigh Ride by Mountain, which is a 20 minutes. They did a 20-minute version of, which is one of his favorite records at the time. This tells you where everyone's head's at musically. Still, nothing out of the ordinary. Normal band, normal night. Few people watching. Clap, clap. Very good. Off they went. He says, then the Sex Pistols gear was set up. Then without further ceremony, they came on. Johnny Rotten, Glenn Matlock, Steve Jones, and Paul Cook. Steve Jones was wearing a boiler suit, and the rest of them looked like they just robbed a thrift store. Rotten had this torn open yellow sweater, and he glared out into the audience like he wanted to kill each and every one of us, one at a time. Before the band struck up into something that might have been Did You Know Wrong, but you couldn't tell because it was so loud and dirty and distorted. So obviously this has a huge impact on him, and he says, I was thinking two things that I suppose you'd have to say came together to create my future, my whole life from then on. The first was, I could do that, because fucking hell, what a racket. I mean, they were just dreadful. Well, the sound was dreadful. Now, the other band didn't sound that bad. They sounded normal. But it was almost as though the Pistols sound guy had deliberately made them sound awful, or they had terrible equipment on purpose because it was all feeding back, fuzzed up, a complete din. A wall of noise. I didn't recognize a tune, not a note, and considering they were playing so many covers, the Monkees, the Who, I surely would have recognized something had it not sounded so shit. He also notes the most important thing about the band was definitely Johnny Rotten. The tunes were only part of the package, and probably the least important part, if he's going to be honest. And I think this is interesting for him to be a musician that played bass in such a famous band, to know that, it's not about him and the guitars. It's about finding the right singer. So getting Ian Curtis is definitely a big deal for him eventually. And you had to have someone up front to really convey what the band was about. And in this case, he feels like the band was conveying everything that he felt as a teenager. Fuck off. We don't fucking care. We're shit. We don't care. All the confusion about the future that turns into arrogance and rebellion. And he says, God bless him. Whatever he had, he gave a bit of it to us, because that was the second thing I felt after I can do that. It was, I want to do that. No, I fucking need to do that. So he ends up going to buy a bass with whatever money he can scrape together, 40 pounds, I guess, from his mom, and takes a bus to a music store to get one. And the conversation at the music store goes like this. Well, it was, I guess, maybe not technically a music store. It's called Maisels on London Road, Piccadilly in Manchester. And he finds out, that Barney, the guitar that Barney got from his parents was about 40 pounds. So Maisel Radio is a shop that always felt dark. It was that filled with weird, indecipherable stock. It was an Aladdin's cave stuffed with transistors, valves, accumulators, TVs, radios, and all kinds of electrical doodahs and cheap guitars. Can I have one of those, please? I said, pointing at them. Well, what kind do you want, son? Said the bloke behind the counter. A bass one. And he went, well, how about this one? Is that a bass guitar? Yeah, that'll do. So I bought my first guitar, which I've still got. A Gibson EB0 copy. No make on it. They tried to sell me a case, but after a bus fare, I didn't have enough money, so I took it home in a black garbage bag they fished out from behind the counter. Very punk. Very punk indeed. Johnny Ramo did something similar with his blue Mosrite that he bought at it might have been Manny's music store in New York City. He carried his around in a shopping bag, but there's great photos of them coming up from a subway station, and he's wearing one of his Captain America t-shirts and his leather jacket, and he's carrying the shopping bag with this blue Mosrite surf guitar sticking out at a weird angle. Glorious. I want to take some time to talk about The Crow by James O'Barr. before it became anything else. Now, have I read it? Yes, I have. Twice. Once, as a teenager, in a mall, killing time at a Hot Topic, because they used to have books there, and that is how, books combined with the relative disinterest of the people that were working there back in those days, to come around and like bug you and ask you when you were leaving. Not that that happens to me now. I don't go to Hot Topics and stand around and do stuff until the folks that work there come tell me to leave. But, you know, it was the 90s. People really, really didn't care. That's how I read most of Henry Rollins's Get in the Van and Black Coffee Blues at the time, as a matter of fact. Being at the mall, it was better than being where I was elsewhere. But, you know, because I was too young to be able to go into Seattle and go see shows or whatever. I think the real impact of it, you know, hit me a lot harder when I reread it a couple years ago while doing all the research for this episode and rewatching the film and listening to the director's commentaries and stuff and learning more about the making of the whole project. And, you know, seeing somebody grow in front of you when you're flipping through these pages is a remarkable thing. And to qualify that, or to explain what I mean by that, I should actually point out that the collected story that I read a couple years ago had a new epilogue tacked on that James O'Barr had written many years later. That was sort of a release and a forgiveness for himself and for Eric Draven at the same time. And so I can look, you know, I'm talking about looking at the first panels of the first page of the first issue all the way through the final pages of the epilogue that he wrote years and years later. At the time, as a young person in the 90s, I had read mainstream comic books, superhero stuff, and I had a lot of, a weird feeling like I'd missed out on something big when it came to the independent comics boom of the mid to late 80s. I don't know if it was a boom, but if people in the industry would call it that, but that's when a lot of it happened. You know, I'd go to the comic store to get my Spider-Mans and my X-Men's, and I'd flip through a Love and Rockets, or I'd flip through a Sandman, and a lot of other more independently grown ideas that were flourishing in the hands of independent adult creators for free-thinking adult audiences, and realize that, like, I'm just not the right audience for a lot of this stuff, and I don't know if I will be buying comic books when I get to the age that I am. So, I mean, especially Sandman, I would look at the covers and just be enthralled, and then open them up and go, this is not the same artist. And this is very wordy, and there's a lot of literary references I don't even get. I don't even know that they're literary references, but I assume they are based on the way people are dressed and the way that they're looking and acting, blah, blah, blah. So, I say all this to sort of give you a couple of indications of my bias, as I always do in these shows. So my impression of O'Barr's work is definitely colored by the fact that I was into comic books that were more mainstream at the time, but I was very drawn to what I saw in The Crow. But as far as I knew, there was mostly just that main story. Like, it wasn't like a Sandman comic where it was going to be coming out, you know, every month, and there would be different story arcs and blah, 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 blah. I thought it was just pretty much a self-contained thing about Eric Draven. And, you know, there'd be other instances in the future where the Crow stories would be expanded on, or, you know, other new stories would be told. But for the most part, you didn't get the feeling that, like, oh, I better get with the origin story, and so I can get caught up to the, you know, current narrative. it was like, no, this guy wrote a story about, this fictional fantasy that helped him push through a lot of his own pain. And that was very evident when I read it on the page. You can see how his sort of approach to certain kinds of framing or art or shading or expressions on the faces of the characters would sort of get more effective as time went on in a lot of ways. And then you could see the telltale signs of, a lot of young and up and coming artists where, this is a this is a couple of panels he spent a lot of time on. And then there's a couple panels that are a little more action oriented and leave more of the imagination or whatever. Didn't spend so much time on things like that. And it was interesting to see, how devoted he was to the idea that the Crow would only speak in quotes of poetry. He wasn't a friendly guy that came along and, earned your trust as a citizen of the town or as a former friend. He didn't come along and just, talk and give encouraging speeches to a young girl that used to know him, that kind of a thing, Some of my notes from back then when I was rereading it and preparing for this episode that wouldn't come out for another 2.5 years. The guy does draw more believable human forms than many of his peers at the time. Even that statement is hard to qualify because who were his peers at the time? I don't know that he had many. On one hand, you've got some very stylized people in the independent scene that have a lot quirkier sort of approaches to how they draw men and women in the so-called real world, without superheroic tropes to the visuals. And then you have the superheroic tropes visually of what was going on in the mainstream. And even when it was well executed, it was still tropey. It was still stereotypical for what it was or what it was trying to achieve. Those aren't my notes. Those are me just see. I can't read a one phrase or 2 sentences of anything that I've written years ago without expounding upon it. So it's almost as bad as when I read other people's work, obviously, if you've been listening to the show for long enough. But, the point I was trying to make was, unlike a lot of quirky and stylized independent artists, he's not as artsy-fartsy. He's, very consistent in a lot of ways to the human anatomy and the skeletal structure and musculature, but not as, consistent as those superhero guys. But I would also say that he was pulling off things that appear much more human and much more impactful. He wasn't just drawing from the same 5 to 6 to 7 poses, with a big gun or standing up on top of a building or, that crouch position when they land after jumping off of that building. That, the stuff he was doing was, he was really trying to get the acrobatics of the character across and the limberness and the sort of ballet dancer-ishness of that across. In a way that I wonder if that influenced Robert Rodriguez when he did the Mariachi trilogy, because he was pretty clear that he wanted his character, to move like a dancer, not like a normal, punch 'em up action hero that you're used to. But even masters of the time, in my opinion, like Jim Lee, his X-Men stuff in the early 90s made him rich and famous. But you could change the hair color on Rogue or Storm or Jean Grey, and you wouldn't know they were different characters, except for maybe what they were wearing and the fact that usually Storm didn't have an iris or pupils in her eyeballs. Like Cyclops was just every man with muscles. He could have been Captain America. Cable was bigger and bulkier in a ridiculous way, but that was mostly Rob Liefeld's thing. But it was still like Cyclops, but wider. Wolverine was like Cable, but half the size. Many expressive artists would convey emotion better in their facial features and their facial expressions and body language, in a lot of cases than maybe a young, inexperienced James O'Barr. But they wouldn't be able to do a lot of tech drawing very well. Not that O'Barr did either, but he wasn't getting paid by a huge company like Marvel or DC. He was figuring this out on his own. Young Trent Reznor did not have any interest in the punk sound or integrating into the punk community. His ideal was the independence provided him through technology to stay away from community. Synthesizers allowing him to not be part of a movement, essentially. He describes this as the excitement of hearing a Human League track and thinking, that's all machines, there's no drummer. That was my calling. It wasn't the Sex Pistols. So he drops out of college in 84. He moves to Ohio City, which is an older neighborhood in Cleveland. And Trent gets a job at a place called P.I. Keyboards, which is a major supplier of sound electronics around that area in that time. And it's a little south of Cleveland in a suburb called Parma. In the Cleveland music scene, there's a lot going on. There's dozens of local artists in all kinds of genres. There's funk music, there's punk rock. There's presumably your typical, white meat, blue collar, Bob Seger, Bruce Mellencamp, kind of stuff, I'm sure. There's a local radio station, WMMS, that dominates everything. If you've listened to the Devo episodes, one is in the main feed, one is in the Patreon. You'll know about WMMS. Their programmers broke David Bowie and Roxy Music and supported Bruce Springsteen early in his career. Now, this allows, touring acts from other parts of the world, Europe, presumably, to utilize this sort of hotbed of local talent to pull from when it comes to support acts in the Cleveland area. Like they can tour the United States and maybe they don't have to haul along, an opener when they get here. And this creates visibility for anyone that gets noticed to play some big stages and gain a lot of notoriety, opening for more cutting edge music from out of town. In Cleveland, Trent was a constant presence at a lot of shows in the area, like a punk dive in Lakewood called Fantasy Nightclub, which ended up being the place that Trent first sees a Jane's Addiction show. And he was mesmerized by the presence of Perry Farrell there. That was a big influence on him. He had been a big childhood fan of Kiss, Pink Floyd, and Supertramp. And then is finally in a place where his horizons are being expanded. He's in the Cleveland scene, and he's not just on this steady diet of, what was on American rock radio in the later 70s anymore. He's seeing things on the outskirts for the first time. He joins a top 40 cover band called The Urge, and they did like a regional circuit. So he got some travel in under his belt and had learned so many songs during this time that many years later, when he put together his own first lineup of Nine Inch Nails, sometimes the band and the road crew would pass the time by playing a game where they would sing the worst songs that they all knew. And to their shock and amusement, Trent would instantly be able to call up the tunes on his, basically just start playing on a keyboard while they're just like belting out, some cornball 80s one-hit wonder or something like that. He knew it. He knew everything. He had just like this encyclopedia in his head of crummy top 40 music from that era. By 1985, he was in an actual original sounding group called the Exotic Birds. They had 3 guys from the Cleveland Institute of Music. They were a go-to opener for traveling acts like the Eurythmics and the Thompson Twins. And the guy that was the manager for the Exotic Birds would end up becoming Trent Reznor's manager until they went to court to duke it out, I guess, in 2005. But that's a long fucking run. Weird coincidental story. This is around the time that Trent Reznor sells his Lynn drum machine, which we mentioned in the Devo notes, to a guy named Chris Verena. He was a drummer from Erie, Pennsylvania. He had a synth band that had played with the Exotic Birds, but he was still in high school at the time. He visited Cleveland a lot and eventually went to Kent State, which the guys in Devo also did. Reznor would ask him to drop out of college and join the Birds, which he ended up doing and becoming Trent's roommate for that time. And if you've listened to my Joan Jett episode that I covered Light of Day, this is about the time when he was in the Exotic Birds that Trent was featured on screen in the Paul Schrader film, Paul Schrader of Taxi Driver fame. He shot this film in Cleveland. It's about a brother and sister in a rock band. It's very depressing. I mean, it's like it's even got Michael McKean as one of the band members. So, like, you know, the funny guy from Spinal Tap and Laverne and Shirley, and then the funny guy from Back to the Future and Family Ties in a very dour, tense, depressing, and at times boring movie about family drama and economic strife in Cleveland. So their band is playing in a bar, and in the background, you know, there's a group called The Problems. You can't tell until you watch the whole movie and then see the end credits. They're called The Problems, and Reznor is sort of bopping up and down behind a synth for about a second and a half. If you catch it, you gotta really, really get ready with your mouse and click pause at just the right time to catch it. Supposedly, they were playing a cover of Buddy Holly's "True Love Always." By watching the movie, I couldn't really tell. So Barney and Hook are getting together to practice their instruments now. And, you know, Hook doesn't know how to play. He doesn't know anything much about music. But they did get books. The Palmer Hughes Book of Rock and Roll Guitar and Rock and Roll Bass Guitar. He said his came with stickers for the neck of the bass so you knew where to put your fingers. They would wear off, of course, after he'd sweat all over it, and then he would sort of paint them on with, he said, Tipex. I don't know if that's like nail polish or something. He said we'd be sitting around practicing and Barney shouting out the chords like play A, 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 and then we'd change to G, 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 G. I'd practice by myself too, but it was far more interesting learning together than it was playing on your own at home. Teaching myself meant I ended up learning it wrong, though, because I picked up the bad habit of playing with 3 fingers. A teacher would have made me play with 4, but the Palmer Hughes Book of Rock and Roll Bass Guitar didn't talk back, so I started off and have ended up a 3-fingered bass player. He talks about them rehearsing in Barney's Grand's front room. And they would, I guess, get into her record player, an old stereogram, and Barney was good enough with the electronics that he could wire up the guitar cables to the 2 input wires on the needle cartridge of the tone arm of the record player so they could play through the speakers of that. He says it worked as well. I mean, it sounded fucking diabolical, and if we both played at the same time, you couldn't hear anything but a wall of noise, but it worked. Or it worked until his grandma found out what they'd done to her stereo and cussed them out for doing so. He talks about getting into a bit of a routine, you know, getting together, playing around a bit on the instruments, go outside, walk down the street, get shouted at for dressing like punks and having spiked hair, being treated like a leper. And, you know, which is sort of why they kept doing it. It was getting a response. They figured that was the right way to go. Their parents hated it, and they had to get changed on the bus because they couldn't get away with like leaving the house looking the way they wanted to if their parents were around to stop them. So they would, keep their eyes up for the next big happening as far as bands playing in Manchester. And it turns out to be the Pistols' second gig, July 20th, also at Lesser Free Trade Hall. Apart from the venue, he says it was a completely different situation. We were punks now. We knew what to expect from the band. Plus, there were more people there because word had spread in Manchester, but also because the Pistols had brought a busload of supporters with them this time, which was exciting. He says, at the time, if you put a group of Londoners, Cockneys, in other words, and a group of Mancunians into a municipal building at the same time, the, shall we say, regional differences meant a fight was bound to break out, which it did. So he and his buddies are at the bar, talking to these kids who'd come over to us. One of them's going, hey, you fucking Cockneys or what? All up in our faces. I went, no, fuck off, mate. We're from Salford. I apologize to anyone from the UK listening to me not even barely try to pull off a passable accent, but I can't help it sometimes. I usually try not to. Turned out they're from Manchester too. Wythenshawe? We're a group, they said. Oh, right, we're a group too, sort of. Well, we're Slaughter and the Dogs. We're supporting tonight. Wow, it was Slaughter and the Dogs. And this bloke's name was Mick Rossi, the guitarist. I guess they were one of the earliest punk bands in Manchester, and they were playing that night with the Buzzcocks too, and the Sex Pistols. The guys ask them what their group is called, and they're like, we don't know. We don't have a name. And they're like, and they also inside, they're like, yeah, we don't have any songs either. We don't have a singer either. But, they felt justified enough saying they had a band. Now, after this exchange, Rossi all of a sudden goes, right, Cockneys are here, clenches his fist. We're having the Cockneys. We're fucking having them. And this was the support band, so it was a hell of an atmosphere right from the beginning, he says. True to form, there was as much fighting as there was pogoing and moshing, everyone rolling around the room. It was more good-natured than you might have expected, but even so, pretty chaotic because of all the scraps breaking out, a lot more exciting than the first gigs. At the first gig, it all went off on stage. At the second gig, it all went off in the audience and on stage. The story is Ian Curtis was at this gig and did actually speak to Barney and Peter Hook, although Peter admits he doesn't remember it if that happened. His memory of meeting Ian was at a place called the Electric Circus, which is an older, more normal rock, like traditional rock venue, and that was also, I guess, a Sex Pistols gig with the Buzzcocks and with Slaughter and the Dogs. Now, he does admit that at shows like this, and from here on out, they were kind of trying to get noticed, but they didn't know a lot of people in the scene by name. So they would sort of, him and Barney would sort of stand off on the side and just sort of like give the old nod and like, hey, how's it going? How you been? Like to people that they didn't really know the names of, and did an attempt to just sort of be cool and get people to talk to him. And he definitely noticed Ian for sure this time because he had what they called a donkey jacket with the word hate spray painted in fluorescent orange on the back. And he said he was nice. He was softly spoken, sharp sense of humor. And of the two portrayals of him on film, I prefer the one in 24-Hour Party People. The guy in control, Sam Riley, played him as being much more arty and conventionally pretty than he was in real life, whereas Sean Harris in 24-Hour Party People had a bit more of the real-life Ian's edginess and intensity. Neither was perfect, and neither was totally off the mark, but for my money, Harris is the more accurate. Back to The Crow now, and Mr. James O'Barr. I think it's a very rewarding experience to not just read what he wrote, but to look through it and see the energy and see the passion and see the director's eye for framing and composition and things like that. I mean, maybe not a very sophisticated director, but I've watched a lot of great movies by a lot of not sophisticated directors, let me tell you. They are refreshing. especially after all the mainstream stuff that is consistent and is predictable and does just do the same thing over and over again. And on the other side of me saying I don't know who his peer group is are people like, Mobius and other Metal Hurlant artists that drew believable textured living things as well as big mechanized things that had weight and would sort of impose themselves, on your eyeballs. They were stylized, but impactful and almost tangible in a certain way to your eye, because the world they created was a place you bought into visually. And even though it was outlandish and it was fantastic and phantasmagorical and not real, you bought in and you were there. You felt the weight when you're dragging your eyeball across those panels. Now, Frank Miller's Sin City's art is a little closer, but the human features and the frames in those panels are so stylized in a good way, not in a bad way, like Rob Liefeld, whose only style is unproportioned into oblivion and lots of sketchy lines. No one seems touchable, I think. That's how stylized they are. But they're consistent and they're heavy in a way that makes sense in the panels and in the world of Sin City. If that makes any sense to anyone that's listening right now. The world makes sense there, but there are enough artistic touches to all of it to make it seem a bit dreamlike all the time. Please don't call in right now. I'm recording this. Don't interrupt me to tell me about all the good artists and that disprove what I'm saying here. Number one, I'm not reading comic books anymore, even if they are good. Haven't in a quadrillion years. Number two, I'm strictly talking about the mid 80s through 1991 mainstream or relatively well-known indies of that time. Three, I appreciate your heart and your desire to make me a better person, but we can't do this forever. I have to get on. Have to get back to Ian and get back to Trent. Have to talk about the making of the movie. Haven't even finished talking about the setup and the creation of the comic book. Good Lord, can I yammer on? You're such a good person for sitting through this stuff. But that doesn't mean I don't need your money. Throw a couple clams my way sometime. Maybe not now. Maybe not today. Maybe not tomorrow. But check out the Patreon and get more of this kind of thing. Just more broken up and busted up versions of this kind of thing. Not on a long landscape for your earballs like you're hearing right now. But to wrap up my thoughts and my impressions of O'Barr's work, I find it touching. I find it, yes, primitive in the early days that he was doing it, but impactful, artistic, more realistic in a lot of ways than a lot of mainstream comics at the time, that for artists that made a lot more money. Not as focused and decided upon what it consistently was going to be, like a lot of indie comics at the time. But that's the point. If seeing a young, inexperienced artist draw things that are a little wobbly and out of proportion at times and don't look like Captain America, built in a digital environment, on someone's iPad these days, is going to throw you off, then you're not going to enjoy it. But if you like a bit of archaeology, like going back and digging through old cultural stuff that seems like many worlds away, even though it was only a few decades ago, I think if you already like The Crow, let me put it that way, it's worth your time. Now, let's talk O'Barr himself. He grew up for the first 7 years of his life in foster care, and he hated it. He was born in 1960 in Detroit, Michigan. The only thing that he hated more than his life in orphanages was his life after he was adopted at age 7. I mean, the young child, James O'Barr. Obviously, there's things in his life that he would hate worse than that as the years went on. He was an avid reader because, he had the head for it. He had the intellect for it, but also because he really craved escape from his immediate surroundings and his family life. He was eventually taken on, swept up by art. His early teens, he was kind of obsessed with Michelangelo. And then when he hit 15, his influences were more sword and sorcery books, Frank Frazetta's paintings of Conan the Barbarian, which is interesting because in a weird little coincidence, Ed Pressman, the producer of the Crow film, started his producing career with the Conan the Barbarian film from the early 80s. That is what it is because, in large part, Arnold Schwarzenegger, John Milius, Oliver Stone. Now, this is back in an era in his teens. We're talking 1975 to 1980, where comic book conventions are not what they conjure in your mind these days. They're not, large convention center in the middle of a glistening skyscraper-ridden city filled with paid models walking around dressed like Electra or Black Widow, trying to drum up attention for the costumer that made the things that they're wearing, and then featuring appearances in large halls by Hollywood actors, writers, directors, people that work for Disney Plus, trying to drum up excitement about the new thing that sucks or is very good, depending on your point of view, that is supposed to captivate your imagination for the next 6 months until it comes out. And then you read all the good reviews and all the bad reviews and then move on with your life and forget it. This is an era where, comic conventions are like one step up from a flea market. And if you don't know what a flea market is, I can't help you. But people, comic book stores show up, pay for a table, try to sell a bunch of old back issues. And this is before a big collector's boom happens in the 90s. This is well before large resin statues of, Batman go on sale for $1,200 or whatever. This is before the collectibles market in terms of toys and action figures and things like that. So if you're going to one of these things and it's on the East Coast, if it's in New England, you're probably going to be able to get the attention of a lot of writers and artists that work for some of the major publishing companies. But, if you're further out in Detroit, I imagine there'd have to be some incentives for a lot of these guys to come out, sign autographs, and maybe take a few photos or whatever. Meet the kids, meet the fans that buy their books, and maybe commission them to draw things for them, that kind of stuff, so they can make a buck or two in a weekend. And this is where young artists go to bring their portfolio before the pros and get some hints or get some contacts maybe, or get some advice on what to do next. And at age 14, James O'Barr says, the artist he really admired that actually took the time to look at his stuff and give him some pointers and compliment him. The only one that spoke to him in a sort of kind and encouraging manner was Vaughn Bodie. He said he was the first one to ever give me really positive feedback on my stuff. He loved the way he portrayed violence. Bodie, he's saying that he was a fan of Vaughn Bodie's because he, just the way he laid out a scene, it was really influential on me. And Vaughn Bodie is a guy that I had to look up when I read that a couple years ago and found out that, he created a character called Cheech Wizard that looks very similar to a character in Ralph Bakshi's Wizards animated feature film. And it turns out he had a relationship with Bakshi, and I think they worked together. I believe he got paid for his artistic input on that film and the design work and things like that. There's a lot of stuff that he did that is very influential for the graffiti artist scene in New York City and other cities in the late 70s and early 80s. And his style is very, very proto head shop. I know that's not even a term anymore. I didn't use that term when head shops were referred to as head shops when I was a young person, but before Spencer's Gifts and eventually Hot Topics came around, the kind of shops that would sell large wax candles that were brightly colored mushrooms, things, posters that young people would stare at while doing psychedelics. That his style was very colorful and very interesting and very cartoonish in a droopy, stonery way. Clearly there was some influence from the R. Crumbs of the world and that underground stoner drug culture of the 60s and 70s that influenced Vaughn Bodie. But his style seemed to be very much its own kind of thing. And you can find some of that stuff on archive.org or elsewhere. I don't know if he's still alive. Pay the guy for it if he is, please. One guy James O'Barr says was a real dick to him was Dave Cockrum of Marvel Comics. In the book about the making of The Crow by Bridget Bayes, his name is misspelled. And I don't know if that's intentional to avoid any sort of legal fracas. It's not spelled with a K, it's spelled with a CH. And I don't know, maybe that's his real spelling of his real name, for all I know. Dave Cockrum is not that good. He was never a great X-Men artist, in my opinion. There were so many guys that were more consistent than him that came before him. I mean, the John Buscema's and the John Romita Seniors and the Barry Windsor Smiths of the world were so good. And then the guys that came after him were so great. Even the early work of a young Frank Miller and a young John Romita Jr. and many others in the 80s were so much better than this guy. But he's famous because he was the first guy to draw a lot of the X-Men characters that you think of in your head when you think of the X-Men. The ones that were more popular after the first team sort of moved off into the sunset. The team from the early 60s that was created in like 61 or 62 or whatever the hell it was. You know, the team that had like Nightcrawler and Storm and Wolverine, most importantly, and Colossus and all that stuff. He was the first guy to draw them in a book together. I believe Len Wein was the guy that drew Wolverine originally in a couple of issues of the Hulk 181, 182 or something like that before him. But that guy, Dave Cockrum, was a dick to James O'Barr, which sucks because Dave Cockrum, well, even if you're talented, that's no right. You have no right to be a dick to some young person that's asking for advice. So the quote from James is, there was this guy, Dave Cockrum. He was like a big deal because he was drawing X-Men at the time. He essentially told me I had no talent and I should take up truck driving. And we're not talking about like him bringing the Crow necessarily. This is a 14, 15-year-old kid that's just trying to, draw comic booky stuff and needs a little nudge in the right direction. He admits that eventually when he did get to writing and drawing the Crow, it was autobiographical, based on his own experience and retold in sort of a magical fairy tale tragedy, revenge, gothic way. And he said, when I was 16, I met this girl and she was like the best thing that ever happened to me. Up until that point, my life felt like an endurance test. And I felt like I finally got to the end of it. Good things were finally going to start happening to me. And so I was with this girl for 3 years and we got engaged to get married when we graduated. And she was like my whole world. A couple of weeks before her 18th birthday, she was killed by a drunk driver. That was like completely devastating to me. And I had no idea what to do with my life then. I was just filled with such anger and frustration. And I thought that I was going to destroy myself. And in an interview that I've seen, and it might be on the Crow DVD or Blu-ray, if I'm not mistaken, he blamed himself for a long time because she was like walking home from work or something and he couldn't pick her up because he didn't have car insurance. He didn't have a car, or his car was broken. He didn't have money to fix it. It was one of those things. Basically, being poor meant he couldn't legally drive at that time. And she was walking down a side street or an alleyway and got cut down by this car. And I just want to say that, in those days, in the early 1980s, drunk driving wasn't really as looked down upon in our society in America as it is today in, the 2020s, or even in the 2010s or the 20-ishes or the 1990s. There had to be a big social and multimedia campaign to sort of make people a little more ashamed of that kind of behavior. And even then, it's tough to change that mentality in a lot of people. It's a huge issue. There's many layers to it, but I just want to say I'm guilty of engaging in that kind of activity a lot when I was younger, especially. And I was surrounded by a peer group for which that was no big deal. And luckily, I never heard anybody doing it, but I haven't done it in well over a decade. But that had to come as a result of some behavioral changes on my own and through some situations where I just had to take that whole activity off the table for myself. And it's tough to keep doing when you learn how easy it is to be over the legal limit to drive. Any one of your friends that you're drinking with out in public, if they do a shot and a beer, I guarantee you they're over the line by the time, unless they stop drinking then and sit around for 2 hours, 2.5, 3 hours maybe, they're not going to be totally sober when they drive, which isn't to say they're a bad driver when they're drunk. Lots of people can drive just fine in certain situations when they're drunk. Unfortunately, somebody else can be sober and texting on their phone and then run into them. And, that your drinking person, it will be the one at fault. And accidents happen. People stumble out in the street. Drunk people stumble out into the street as well. And I think if you're driving a car that kills them or maims them, especially if you've been drinking, you're going to be at fault most likely. That's mostly the end of my PSA. I just want to say, if you're worried about that kind of thing with yourself or somebody else, go to some of those meetings, man. People talk about their experiences. No one that gets popped for drunk driving, no one that's ever hurt or killed someone while they were driving drunk ever thought they were taking those lives in their own hands. It's one of those things we should be more upfront about, I think, and not just blindly shame people about. I think it's a mentality that has to change. Our society doesn't always make it that easy. I guarantee you there's cops right now drinking in a bar, tying one on, getting behind the wheel, over the legal limit, driving home. They'll never get in trouble for it. Citizens probably will eventually if they keep doing it. I guarantee you there's smart people, accomplished people, rich people doing that all the time. And it doesn't feel like it's wrong. That's the nature of the evil of that activity. All right, done with that part. Moving on. Except to say, if you're lucky enough to live in a place where you can go to a drugstore or a department store or someplace and spend or have an online Amazon store, spend between $40 to $60 on a battery-powered blood alcohol breathalyzer tester. It is absolutely worth the money. You will find out how much more drunk you are all the time than you think you are, which is the nature of drunkenness. That's how it clouds your mind. That's how it dulls your senses. And you will be shocked, as I was, to find out having a 6.5 or 7% red ale at lunchtime and then walking a mile home, even with an uphill climb and lots of, deep breathing and lots of what feels like, a lot of lung work and cardio and blood circulation. You'd be surprised at how long it takes that microbrew to get out of your system. It took like 2.5, 3 hours, I think, to get totally clear, or at least down to 0.02%. Shocking. If you drink IPAs, fucking forget it. If you drink cocktails and no one's mixing them 1 ounce measured out at a time, you're fucked. Forget it. And you know what? When they do, those cocktails taste like shit. There's no point in drinking those. I'm sorry. Back to Nine Inch Nails now. You notice you haven't heard any ads yet? At least not that I know of. At this time, as of this time, there are no ads on my show. If you'd like to help out and support, please tell a friend about it. Or look in the description for this episode and see the links to the different ways you can help support. It's a one-man operation, and I make no money doing it as of yet, but I'm still happy to do it. Thank you. Now, there's more movements coming up of Trent bouncing from band to band. If you're just wondering why the hell I'm talking about it, this has nothing to do with Nine Inch Nails. I think it sets a good sort of precedent, and it's for the kind of things that Trent wants to avoid later when he just takes control of his own career musically. And I think it's a good indicator of how much he learned along the way that empowered him to do the stuff that he couldn't do with a regular band full of people, when he was so intent on doing things his own way, and he had the capability to do it, and now the experience, having learned what he had learned in all these other groups, playing in the Great Lakes club circuit in the mid-'80s. This is around a time in 87 now when Ohio raises the drinking age from 19 to 21. Fewer kids in the bars means fewer kids in bands that have a place to play. Things get less interesting, less diverse, less fun in that way, and so the talent pool gets a little smaller. Culture isn't as wild when it comes to the regional bands playing around. Trent joins a group called Slam Bamboo, which is kind of a mainstream electro pop sound. Their first single ever played for 22 weeks on local radio. He was playing in the band in time to record a second single called White Lies. Their singer, his name was Scott Hansen, refused to share money or credit with the other members of the band. So Trent leaves, plays with a guy named Tom Lash in a band called Lucky Pierre, which is described as an avant-garde post-punk band started in 1978 by local musician savant Kevin McMahon. Lash remembers driving to San Francisco with Trent and recording tracks with McMahon while there. He says, when Trent heard the caliber of stuff Kevin was doing, it was an impetus to do his own stuff that was interesting and unique. Kevin was writing stuff that was way more advanced than anything in Cleveland. He was like Ray Davies. He could do the hardest, noisiest, craziest stuff, and then piano ballads and cabaret. After getting back from San Francisco, Trent puts his performing on hold and gets a job at a place called Right Track Studios. And he's going to sort of parlay this job into the opportunity to record solo material. At this point, Trent's played in 6 bands in 4 years. He doesn't have to draft other people to make his ideas come to life now. He's got the technology, he's got the studio, he's got time in a sort of piecemeal way to make that happen while he's working, at this place. He said in 1994 in a Keyboard Magazine interview, "I use electronics because I want to, not as a compromise for something else." And that's just relevant because this is the time when I guess some people telling the story like to either imply or outright state that Trent Reznor couldn't afford bandmates, and that's why Pretty Hate Machine was done all by himself, when it seems closer to the truth that no, there's just no need. There was just no need for it. He was a maintenance guy and a MIDI programmer at the studio. He had also played keyboards on other people's demos and then clean up the place at night. The owner was a guy named Bart Koster, who would acknowledge Reznor's focus was already so singular that even when that guy waxed the floor, it looked great. And he would work late into the night for the clients that were paying for studio time, and then when they left, he would work on his own stuff until morning. Trent claims he never wrote a single song prior to Down In It, the first Nine Inch Nails single ever. I like this quote from the 33 1/3 book about Pretty Hate Machine, and I'm calling it out because I'm so grouchy about this fucking book. Like this thing, I'm such a scumbag that I bought this off of Amazon and then just took photos of the relevant pages and sent it back because there's very little relevant material in the text when it comes to the making of Pretty Hate Machine or the history of Nine Inch Nails up to that point. There's more information in this book about the history of Hot Topic, and I know that sounds like hyperbole, but if you count the pages, it's not that far off. More about the history of Hot Topic than the history of Nine Inch Nails in this thing. Because what the author did was, write a narrative of the early days of Nine Inch Nails, which is what I'm drawing from, and then just farm out the writing of the rest of the book to Nine Inch Nails fans. She had Nine Inch Nails fans write an essay about what each song means to them personally, and that's what she published. I hope they all got paid. If they didn't, I would burn this person alive in the streets. Hopefully they're all getting checks from every single sale, every unit that this thing moved. Because 33 1/3 is a very well-respected book series that usually provides tons of great information about the recording of one specific album in an artist's career and the before and the after of that phase in their career. But the quote I want to read is outstanding. Many early versions of Pretty Hate Machine tracks, available on the widely circulated bootleg Purist Feeling, attest that he was a novice in arrangement, even as his strong sense of pop song craft was in place. The transformation between Purist Feeling and Pretty Hate Machine is the sound of Reznor's decision that a broken machine sounded better than a well-behaved one. I'm gonna continue on. The grainy, lo-fi digital bleeps of 80s keyboards could little mimic acoustic instruments. The men and women who adopted keys as their own were part of a new wave, pushing the artifice of the sounds by refusing to place them in traditional song structures, to mix them with traditional rock instruments, or to fulfill the traditional expectations for a live band setup. Instead, the adoptees celebrated the otherness of the sounds through lyrics full of obtuse or cold emotion, queer longing, and loneliness, as well as pleasure, while the beats demanded dancing, and long sustain pads issued a bit of melancholy, even as orchestral and horn stabs laughed at the whole thing. All these new wave elements come into play on Pretty Hate Machine's demos. The author also describes a lot of these synth sounds used in primitive industrial music as more subterranean than otherworldly, which I think is the sort of line of demarcation between, 60s and 70s approaches to using synthesizers and 80s and 90s approaches to using synthesizers. And then here's another nice thing about the book. So I'm not being a total dick here. A little list of equipment. This is Pretty Hate Machine is a record of late 80s synthesizers. There was the Prophet VS, the first and last sequential circuits digital synth, and the Oberheim Expander from 1984, which the website Vintage Synth Explorer called the most flexible, non-modular analog synth ever built. Another characteristic instrument Reznor has used ever since the first album is the Mini Moog, which is the low, sort of warm bass-sounding keyboard. But the primary instrument was the EMU Emax SE, an upgraded version of the Emax, the first affordable synth to include a sampler. In 1985, this retailed apparently for $3,000. It was easy to use and easy to get, and a very famous sample library. It was a cutting-edge bit of kit from the mid to late 1980s, and it was favored by a lot of industrial artists at the time, like My Life with the Thrill Kill Cult, Frontline Assembly, who were both from Chicago, and they were on Wax Trax, which you might know about if you know about the history of Ministry and the Revolting Cocks and that whole scene. If not, there's a really cool documentary called Industrial Accident, the story of Wax Trax Records, or the story of Wax Trax, something like that. It was a record store first, then it became a studio, then it became a record label, or I think it was all three at one point. But there's a lot of cool shit there, and those are all artists I know very little about, other than having read, Al Jourgensen's autobiography. I didn't grow up with the stuff. That stuff's all very sort of dark and romantic to me. Like I would have been too young when it was really hitting the peak of the independent scene before the crossover into MTV in the early 1990s. So I have to be, well, I don't have to. This doesn't benefit anybody, but I have to fess up to the fact that The Crow and the music, the darker post-punk music from this era that we're talking about in the late 80s, is all very intriguing to me as a person who was listening to Huey Lewis and the News at the time, because I was about 10 years old. And the scene and the visuals and the manner of dress and hairstyles and the women and the art of that era is very attractive to me in a sort of like, I'll never see that. I never would have, taken, but I probably wouldn't have seen it when it was happening if I was of an appropriate age, or maybe if I was a part of the scene, I would have died of an overdose or something. Who knows? Now the book notes, and it's Daphne Carr is the author of this good stuff. The book notes, 2 years after the release of Pretty Hate Machine, artists who sampled others' work were getting sued regularly. Like if you're into hip hop from the 80s and you wonder why some of those great artists like stopped cranking out music, it's because no one was paying attention until stuff like Yo MTV Raps came along and hip hop got nationwide and they were selling lots of units. Suddenly, when the units start selling and people start getting rich, other folks responsible for the sounds that were being sampled started going to court over that stuff. Unfortunately, that sort of derailed people like Public Enemy in a way that was hard for them to recover from. And I don't know that they ever actually did, quite frankly. But the book notes that back in '89, there was nothing stopping Reznor from using the sampling seconds of his Emacs to borrow freely from his influences. Reznor, who over the past 20 years has been known to lurk on the forums of his Ninternet, that's in quotes, Ninternet, once posted on Prodigy, which was, I think, the version of the internet that was the most accessible in the mid-'90s and late '90s for my more well-to-do friends in high school. I first got the internet when I went to community college, and there was a computer lab in 1997. And I looked up guitar tabs. That's what I did. Go to a guitar tab website, look up how to play the Ren and Stimpy theme song, and then go to some website that was like Dimebag Darrell for president, or something. Those are the good old days. He once posted on Prodigy with a comment on the famous Midnight Express monologue sampled Under the Chance in Sanctified, saying, Pretty Hate Machine had loads of samples from other people's records. In fact, I think almost every drum sound was borrowed as a starting point for manipulation. The monologue's presence on the album is notable since most of the horror and sci-fi samples of Purest Feeling were cut. Reznor thanks Prince, Public Enemy, Jane's Addiction, This Mortal Coil, Clive Barker, and the Success, Screaming Trees UK, in the liner notes, and their samples are among the easiest to identify. Prince's Alphabet Street and Jane's Addiction's Had a Dad in Sanctified especially. I believe the Had a Dad one is the bass. He sampled the bass guitar and Had a Dad for the bass tone in Sanctified. A scratch from Eric B. and Rakim. If you've never heard Eric B. and Rakim, you might know, if you like Rage Against the Machine, that they covered one of their songs in 1999. But just go look up Lyrics of Fury and you'll know how awesome Eric B. is. It appears as the panning intro noise of Sin. A comparative listen of Skinny Puppy's Dig It and Reznor's first demo, Down In It, reveals even more influence. He admits it was a near total rip. It appears that during this time, while he's working on early tracks for Pretty Hate Machine's first incarnation, it was a period where he had sort of begun to react against his previous habits. He'd been on the local Cleveland music scene for 4 years, and I think he's one of those folks that probably was just so good at what he did that he didn't have to try very hard. Apparently he'd be getting high too often, never tried working very hard at much, and so when he really focused up, he decided to create a work schedule for himself that would be this sort of trajectory for the next 10 years of his life. He told Alternative Press magazine in 1990, it was complete isolation every day. I figured I could round myself out when the record was finished. It weirded me out. I got to the point where I couldn't be around people. I think if that kind of experience leads you to success, then that kind of experience probably lends itself well to being your routine when it's time to go back into the studio and make another record. I don't know about his personal habits all that much, but I wonder how healthy that is for most people, even if they are brilliant and they have a good work ethic. If going back into the studio by yourself and shutting the world out and just, focusing deep and hard on all those options you have in the studio is a good thing or a bad thing. It could be both. It could be one or the other sometimes and change, I suppose. I mean, the case of Dr. Dre, he was kind of like that, but he's got like decades of going in the studio and just futzing around with stuff and recording tons of things that never get released, Hendrix started doing that before he died. Prince obviously did tons of stuff that just went to the vault, But let's talk about someone who doesn't have a lot of work laying around in the vault.
Punk enable you to say, fuck you. But somehow, it couldn't go any further. It was just a single, venomous, one-syllable, two-syllable phrase of anger, which was necessary to reignite rock and roll. But sooner or later, someone was going to want to say more than fuck you. Someone was going to want to say, I'm fucked. And it was Joy Division who were the first band to do that, to use the energy and simplicity of punk to express more complex emotions.
So after a bit of time, Hook and Bernard, they tear through a few singers and acquire a drummer. They have a band that's called Stiff Kittens before eventually changing their name to Warsaw after a David Bowie song on the Low album that they liked. And when they were at this yet another very famous Sex Pistols show, the fourth one in a row here, they see Ian Curtis and they strike up a conversation. Let's see. He talks about how Ian's drummer, Martin Jackson, they tried to get him into Warsaw, but he said no and went off to play with a band called Magazine and then a band called Swing Out Sister. So anyway, he left Ian. Still got me a guitarist, though, said Ian, and that was Ian Gray, or Ian Gray, I-A-I-N, a close friend of Ian's and another familiar face on the punk scene. He'd been at the first Pistols gig, says Hook. There are two schools of thought on how Ian ended up joining us. The first is that Ian answered another ad we put in Virgin Records, and I think that's a record store in this case, not like a magazine called Virgin, like a paper. Like they had a cork board up and, singer wanted for this band. But that's not what I remember. Saying that, there are a lot of things I don't remember. The way I thought it happened was the next time we saw Ian at the last Sex Pistols gig at the Electric Circus, we said to him, all right, mate, how's it going? How's your group? You still got Ian as your guitarist? Nah, he's fucked off. And we had a eureka moment. Well, come in with us then. You can sing for us. Either way, the result was the same. We had our lead singer. We met the Saturday after the gig and took him with us for a scramble around Ashworth Valley in Rochdale, getting him well and truly wet and covered in mud. A great way to audition as singers. I highly recommend it. But back to that fourth and last Pistols gig, it was a virtual riot. The kind of night you look back on and wonder how the fuck you escaped with your life. Like I said, the Damned were off the tour because they'd been booted off for some reason. I forget what it is. He doesn't say in the book. He's not the Damned's biographer. I think it's got to be in one of the Pistols books I have somewhere. So the Buzzcocks opened instead, followed by the Clash, Johnny Thunders and the Heartbreakers, and then the Pistols. Jesus Christ, what a night. Who'd been kicked out of not one, but two Manchester hotels earlier that day. It was absolutely packed inside and out. A riot outside and a riot inside. Loads of football fans had come looking for a fight, and the Pistols played under a hail of spit and bottles, with constant fights taking place in front of the stage. Even in the queue outside, you risked life and limb, with the kids on the flats raining bottles and bricks down from the roofs on the punks below. They'd even gone to the trouble of taking the spikes out of the railings around the Electric Circus beforehand to use as ammunition. After the gig, it was bedlam outside, with the punks getting hammered left, right, and center. We flagged down a passing cop car and asked for help getting past these lunatics, and the copper said, "Run behind the van and we'll escort you to your cars." We all trooped behind, but as he set off, he put his foot right down and sped off, leaving us at the mercy of the mob, the bastard. Luckily, Terry's car was nearby, so we dived in and escaped. Funny thing about these Sex Pistols gigs, going back to the very, very first one, 3 guys were also at that first one. A TV music presenter named Tony Wilson, a manager named Rob Gretton, and a guy named Martin Hannett. Martin Hannett would become Joy Division's producer. Tony would be the guy to put them on TV on his live music show. Gretton, was a local DJ as well as a manager, and would be responsible for pushing the band's music and making sure people knew who they were, and would eventually become a label partner in Factory Records, which was started by Tony Wilson. Now, in talking about bringing in Ian Curtis, Sumner says that he knew that Ian was all right to get on with, and that's what we based the whole group on. If we liked someone, they were in. So Ian didn't even have to audition for his slot as their lead singer. He knew, I mean, they knew he was the guy they were waiting for. So Warsaw starts, getting a sound together and playing and wanting to play more shows, but unfortunately find out that they can never play in London with that name because there is a group called the Warsaw Pact in London, and no one's going to let this other band in with a name that sounds like it's a ripoff of theirs. So they are checking out a novel from 1955 called House of Dolls, and it is written by a survivor of the Nazi concentration camps, and it refers to a section of certain camps called the Joy Division, a name that translates into the Joy Division, which is where basically, how Nazis like think that the Jews are filthy and their blood is bad and stuff, and well, if there were some that they decided were attractive enough, they didn't care as much, and they kept them alive in concentration camps to sexually entertain German soldiers. So they didn't get worked to death in the traditional way. They were just, forced into sexual slavery. I suppose there could be other ethnicities that were captured that were, put in the same position as well, not just Jews. But that's my understanding of the concept of it as it was laid out in the novel. So the name Joy Division has this very, very dark connotation that you wouldn't think of when you see it or read it, right? But they get together sort of enough competent music in their minds, in their, according to their standards, trying to be more like the Sex Pistols and be a punk band. And they record their first release. It's an EP titled An Ideal for Living. And they get together the cover art, stamp things on it and make it look like it's a very sort of like Springtime for Hitler sort of looking like happy Nazi propaganda, like a sort of character, at least from the shots that I've seen. Like it's like a member of the Hitler Junge beating a drum. And like the words, like the Joy Division logo has a big exclamation point after the word joy. I guess a bit Devo-ish in a way, I would think, in an unrelated bit of parallel thinking, maybe. A very wry, satirical sense of humor. And apparently they didn't have a chance to listen to it until they went to a club that they've been, playing at called Pips. And like harass the DJ, like, no, it's our record. Play our record, and it's us. It's us guys. Like we've been here all the time. You've seen us. Da, 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 da. He's like, fuck off. And finally, they, people are dancing and stuff, and it's a good night for the DJ, and he doesn't want to ruin it, but he finally gives in and he puts the record on, and evidently it was mastered or pressed at such poor quality that you couldn't even hear what was going on in the song clearly. It was just, it was that kind of a thing. Like there was a big blanket over the band while they recorded it or something, and it was very indistinct, and it just cleared out the dance floor, and everybody was disappointed. And evidently, the song "No Love Lost," which is like track 2 on the EP, has words or spoken lyric sections that are just lifted straight from the novel. Joy Division, just like, about being led around and lined up and waiting for stuff to be done to you, from what little I heard. Really interesting kind of, nasty sounding punk rock, but different. Definitely different from a lot of punk rock that I, hear from the same era from British bands. But the punk scene was more diverse than a lot of us Americans are aware of, based on the BBC documentaries that we've seen on YouTube, I think, for the most part, or the American documentaries about British punk. It always, it takes a while to get past sort of the look and into what the different sounds actually were. England didn't have the access to different kinds of guitars that the Americans did. They didn't have access to different kinds of clothes, and they didn't have the different sort of, diverse arty arty farty backgrounds versus the blue collar backgrounds that other punk bands had. Like, you know, I'm talking like New York City punks. You know, some of them were college looking people. Some of them were, you know, thugs like the Ramones. Some of them were just crazy like the Dead Boys. Some of them were dressing in drag. So it was, compared to that, the British punk scene kind of comes across as very homogenous looking and sounding to a lot of us that, you know, became aware of punk obviously many years after it was a new thing. So that's my bias. I'm always trying to put it out there. It took me a while to understand how different the Damned were than the Pistols and the Buzzcocks, things like that. And when I thought of Joy Division, I sure didn't think of a band that sounded like the stuff, you know, that I'm starting to hear on these early tracks. I think of atmospheric and keyboard driven, you know, moaning songs. But we'll get to that. So James O'Barr is filled with grief, and because he's an artist, he starts acting on that grief in an artistic way, makes the choice to try to work through the destructive feelings he's got and the anger he's got. After a couple years of just carrying it, not knowing what to do with it, and feeling like he was full of poison because of it, he tried to draw and write about it to work out, as he says, all the anger and frustration and bitterness and anger towards God. You know, he felt that though he's not really religious, someone was responsible. His adopted parents were Baptists, but his girlfriend was Catholic, and he kind of came through the Catholic Church sideways, he says. He says, I like a lot of the ideas and the imagery in the religion, but I don't particularly adhere to any one religion. Then, having no prospects, you know, and also not knowing what to do with his life next, really, like one foot in front of the other, and find a career and recover from this. You know, he had no clear sort of like, what do I do? I had a plan. The plan is gone. He joins the Marines. He signs on for 3 years. He says, I didn't want to think anymore. I wanted someone to tell me what to do. I just wanted some direction, put some structure back in my life. I think a lot of artists and a lot of grieving people would probably say the same for those kind of times in their life. So I made this horrible mistake in joining the Marines, and I was in Berlin for a little while. And basically that's where I came up with the idea for The Crow when I was over there, because that was a really isolating experience. Which is wild because he was already isolated enough in his life, you know. I mean, all he had was his fiancée, and that was taken away. You know, he didn't have a family structure around him that he, you know, adhered to. He didn't have, obviously, a habit of going to church or anything like that. He didn't have prospects when it came to his career trajectory. So, in the hopes that it will take some of those feelings of loneliness and emptiness and directionlessness away, he joins the Marines. And it turns out, as soon as they find out that he has some artistic talent, they loan him out to the Army to illustrate hand-to-hand combat manuals, you know. So you're not doing the Marine drills anymore, which actually he's okay with. It gets him out of marching and other things. But you know, now you're a military guy that's on loan to the Army, and they don't probably really bring you in to their tight-knit group because you're a Marine. I don't know what that's like, but I assume even if that's not exactly how it happened, that could easily be how he would perceive it. That's how I would perceive it if I had half a chance to to take all that grief and try to escape it, and then realize I'm still going to be stuck with it, be isolated in a situation like that. But he starts, you know, working on The Crow by himself. And it was a combination of themes of love, death, retribution that actually gave him comfort while he was doing this job that he couldn't stand. Fair enough. At least you got out of the country. You'd be doing a job you couldn't stand if you're working at the local grocery store anyways. So why not? He conceives the character of the Crow as a supernatural force that's driven by love, but also revenge. He says, "One day I just began drawing the Crow. It came pouring out. My character Eric is able to return from the grave because some things just cannot be forgiven. And I believe that there could be a love so strong that it could transcend death, that it could refuse death, and this soul would not rest until it set things right." Essentially, Eric was me, he said. He doesn't physically resemble me, but all the emotional aspects were drawn from myself. A great quote from James O'Barr about Eric Draven himself, the way he envisioned him and the way he used him in the story compared to what you see in the film, where he had to be a little bit more humanized and heroic. He said, "I don't believe Eric is a hero. He can be absolutely cold-blooded and ruthless at times. When he goes into a room to get one person, everyone else in the room is probably going to die as well. I think what he is doing is terribly romantic, but I wouldn't call him a hero." And a point that we'll touch on later when we get into certain elements of the story that couldn't be adapted into the film, even though they were partially attempted. He says, with every one of the people who perpetrated crimes against him and his fiancée, meaning with every act of revenge, with every time he ends their life, he is erasing his reason for being. The closer he gets to the 5 killers, the less reason for his existence, and he can finally be with Shelley. Now, before I get into the musical influences, I want to go back to the artistic influences because I found some other quotes from O'Barr that expand upon the early, the early era of his drawing. Because he mentions guys that were inspiring to Frank Frazetta. So, like any good art history nerd, like any good seeker of inspiration, he didn't just stop at Frazetta. He had to find out, well, who influenced him and who was he taking bits and pieces from and building upon. He says, "Then I discovered the guys that Frazetta was getting his stuff from, people like N.C. Wyeth and Alex Raymond. Also, Will Eisner, creator of The Spirit, huge influence also on Frank Miller later on. Eisner's 1940 strip about a wisecracking masked crime fighter was the first to truly bring cinematic visuals into comic storytelling." And O'Barr says, "When Warren Publishing brought out their Spirit reprints in the 70s, I bought them, but thought they were too cartoony. I was more into the studio guys like Barry Windsor Smith, Jeffrey Jones, Bernie Wrightson, Michael Kaluta, and later really studied Eisner closely. Eisner's use of panels is amazing. He really taught me about layout, pacing, and story structure. He told complete stories in just 8 pages, and they always worked." Now, besides his own story of loss, there was another tragedy he read about in the newspaper that helped inspire the plot line. He said it was about a young couple who were killed tragically over an engagement ring. I thought this was really outlandish. A $30 ring. 2 lives wasted. That became the beginning of the focal point, and the idea that there could be a love so strong that it could transcend death, that it could refuse death, and this soul would not rest until it could set things right. My character of Eric is able to return from the grave because some things just cannot be forgiven. In the comic book, he knows what he's there for. He's like a steamroller, and there's absolutely nothing that's going to stop him from righting this wrong. I know some of those quotes are reminiscent of, stuff I've already said here, but I like the expansion of it. He says that The Crow is a dramatization of his belief that an absolute pure love does exist and that there are no boundaries between good and evil where love is concerned. Which, when you juxtapose that with what he was saying about Eric Draven not being heroic, he's romantic and he's destructive, but he's not a hero. I think that sort of sets everything up very nicely. In 1994, you're not going to have that translated into into a film that's going to make people a lot of money. I think most of us that like the film would agree that the concessions made and the changes made to humanize Eric Draven's character more, to the degree that they did, nowhere near as offensive as what happened to a lot of other comic book characters when they were adapted to a mainstream Hollywood film in the last 40 years or so. And I guess I should check myself at my age by saying mainstream Hollywood film adaptation. That should also extend to Netflix, Hulu, Disney, streaming services, adaptations, and series as well, of course. Now, touching on some of the musical influences, he dedicated the first issue of The Crow to the memory of Ian Curtis of the band Joy Division. And James O'Barr says that the way Ian Curtis fought through his inadequacy in order to communicate really affected me. The band, the content of the songs, I was right on their wavelength. His suicide over his worsening epilepsy just reinforced things even more, since I'm an epileptic myself. In the beginning, I tried to name each chapter after a Joy Division song, but after a while, it became tedious finding ways to make them fit. Besides that, there's quotes throughout The Crow from Jim Carroll. And if you've never heard of Jim Carroll, the easiest sort of entry point, I would say, is the song People Who Have Died. If that doesn't make you a fan, I get it, but it's a fantastic song that I love. And then there's, lyrics from The Cure spread out, in the story of The Crow. Eric's body movements are inspired by Iggy Pop from The Stooges, and solo artist, obviously. But he said when he was in the Marines, he started going out to clubs in Berlin, seeing bands like Bauhaus, Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, and the German industrial groups. So I'm assuming like some, I won't pronounce it correctly, Einstreisen Neubauten or something like that. And maybe a little Kraftwerk, who knows? Maybe it was too late for him to see Kraftwerk in a club back then. I don't know. When he says, when I finally started drawing The Crow, I was listening to The Cure and Joy Division almost exclusively. People say that Robert Smith inspired Eric, or they think it was Johnny Depp and Edward Scissorhands, but actually I used Peter Murphy from Bauhaus. Like I said, I'd seen them in German clubs, thought he was pretty cool, really liked those cheekbones. He also clarifies that the face paint on The Crow on Eric Draven is not a tribute to Kiss or Alice Cooper. It's based on irony from the British theater's Three Faces of Drama: Pain, Irony, Despair. And if you look in the panels, you will see these masks hanging in Eric and Shelley's apartment in scenes of the comic book. Now, the Pretty Hate Machine 33 and a third book spends a few pages sort of breaking down some of the more notable differences between the Purest Feeling demo versions of Pretty Hate Machine and then the results that came out on TVT Records later, after Trent worked with 3 different producers who did their own mixes and sort of their own sort of style working on some of the different songs on the record. If that's interesting to you, go for it. It would be a lot of minutia for me to get into right here, when you could probably just go on YouTube and find the Purest Feeling demos and just A/B the stuff for yourself. I do want to touch on one more thing from this book, and it is after describing sort of, the sounds of Pretty Hate Machine and the difference in the vocal delivery from the demos to the finished product, and then Trent's sort of vocal accents on certain songs and how he approaches, singing in front of the beat versus on the beat. And there was also a nice little bit about the Purest Feeling having a more synth industrial kind of sound with a lot more samples and stuff. And then the finished Pretty Hate Machine product having more of an upfront vocal that is more like pop production, the kind of thing that I think shocked the folks at TVT Records that signed him based on the strength of what they liked about the demos, appealing to maybe a more independent industrial kind of an audience, I suppose. And Trent's little move, like his main subversion at this time stylistically seems to be refusing to go down the typical industrial path, and that's a catch-all word for a genre that people can dispute, obviously. But for the sake of brevity here and the sake of staying on target, he didn't go for the distorted vocals. He didn't go for like a buried kind of sound in the mix of what he was trying to convey with his lyrics and his vocal delivery. And evidently his vocal delivery changed a lot and got a lot more confident in the time between the 1987 and 1989, 1990 era, recording these songs. His vocals come out clean for the most part. I mean, there's some stuff like the quiet parts and the verses of Down in It or something like that. But then he gets, he hits you in the chorus with a really clear upfront vocal and isn't hiding behind anything. And there's a lot more bands in the underground industrial or, successful international industrial scene that had set a standard of like how dirty and how grungy and how distorted all that stuff was portrayed, I guess. This is what helped Trent cross over. I think this is why he had so many female fans. I think this is the Pretty Hate Machine is a very vulnerable sounding, human cry. But it's not wimpy. It's not unmasculine. It's not like flailing around and throwing a fit. A couple of technical notes that I do want to pull from this book. I know I said I was going to read from the book, and then I just went off on my own tangent. There's two things. There's the drum sounds, and then there's the guitar sounds. And I think it's an interesting observation here. It's impossible to know if Pretty Hate Machine would have succeeded as it did had it sounded more like its demos. But it is unlikely that the single Down in It would have fared well without the sub bass of Adrian Sherwood, who was one of the three producers that worked on it. One of the other ones was Flood, who had gotten a pretty good body of work with the Depeche Mode over the years. Let's see. Head Like a Hole, a response to Gottlieb's meddling, one of the other producers, with Reznor's work, wouldn't have been made at all. The most obvious difference between Purest Feeling and Pretty Hate Machine is the drums, some of which were played live on Purest Feeling. The PF beats were either awkward, poorly mic'd, straightforward rock in 4/4, or extremely simple, new wave, industrial hybrid electronic patterns, especially the Italo bass of non-album track, Maybe Just Once. Down in It on Purest Feeling was a rough blend of Eric B. homage and Thrill Kill style sampled industrial atmospheres with unabashed rapping by Trent. Only the keyboard and guitar hooks of the chorus are familiar. The song was reworked for the album by Sherwood so that the drums hit deeper, the vocals relaxed a bit, and the synths lingered more ominously up front. And in Down in It, as everywhere on Pretty Hate Machine and Nine Inch Nails' subsequent recordings, the bass works as both rhythm and melody, another synth with a shorter attack, stronger hook, and more obvious presence. Then they talk about the vocals, and I want to get to... Much has been made of Reznor's merger of synth and guitars. But it is important to note that when Pretty Hate Machine came out, Reznor was seen as a sellout to American industrial, in part because he didn't use enough hard guitar. A comparison with Ministry's The Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste, which we'll get back to in a second. I got some juicy stuff to frame this little timeline with, which came out only a month after Pretty Hate Machine, would suffice to prove this. Broken, Nails' 1992 follow-up EP, would address this critique and pay homage to Ministry with a furious onslaught of guitar. The Pretty Hate Machine demos have more guitar than does the final mix, which pushes up the pads and plays down live guitars while losing the horror samples altogether. Guitars in the album have an unusual distortion, and this is the key thing that I really enjoyed learning about as a guitar player. I always wondered, how come Nine Inch Nails guitars never sound like they're just plugged into tube amps and mic'd up? but they don't sound as bad as like when other people distort their guitars going directly into a mixing console. It's because of how he distorted them. Let's see. Guitars of the album have an unusual distortion created by plugging direct, meaning your electric guitar goes into the recording unit with nothing in between. Supposedly, just the compression and the EQ in the mixing desk, probably. Tracking to a Mac Plus, and this is a 1987 Mac Plus, I assume, and exporting the files to an inexpensive early computer sound synthesis program called TurboSynth. With TurboSynth, Reznor manipulated the sample to produce a truly strange, fearsome tone, unlike a traditional rock guitar sound. Non-demo track Head Like a Hole, often thought of as having heavy guitars, has only 4 distorted notes of guitar in the chorus. Most of the song's feral energy comes from a dominating Prophet 5 bass line, the relentlessly upfront vocal, the dense drum programming, and a multitude of backup layers that mimic chant. There are no more than 4 pitches of guitar on any one song of Pretty Hate Machine, and the guitar is only used for choruses and in middle eights. Reznor has said that Terrible Lie was his audition song for guitarists because it's only 2 notes, but he wanted fingers to bleed for them. Where the synth offers melody and control, the guitar in Nine Inch Nails is a machine for displays of affect. It is a fury of attack and chorus of distortion. Now, it's around this era. Actually, it's a little after A Mind is a Terrible Thing to Taste, and when the Revolting Cocks put out their next record, Beers, Steers, and Queers, that Trent Reznor comes into the story of Al Jourgensen's autobiography. I went and reread this bit and then tried to cross-reference it with a book that I found about Nine Inch Nails. It's the best physical product I have been able to get my goddamn hands on that has a lot of information about Nine Inch Nails. Still plenty of filler, still plenty of meandering to fill out the pages, but it's the best thing I could really, I could find. It's titled Bobcat Books Presents the Story of Nine Inch Nails by Tommy Udo. Respect to Tommy Udo, but his publishing company looks like they want to take all the credit for the release of this book. So I couldn't find anything in this book about the whole Revco tour that Trent Reznor ended up going on, and I'll just read straight out of Al Jourgensen's account of that here in a sec. Also, I noted something. I noticed something when I was flipping through. Like I read through like a couple chapters trying to find this section, right? This section of the story after the sort of Pretty Hate Machine demo era and around the time of the release of the album on TVT. And, there's some good information about him going to Europe and touring with Guns N' Roses, which is wild. It's pretty cool to read about. But there's nothing about the Al Jourgensen ministry experiment in his career. But there's something, as I got towards the end of what I was reading, I'm like, okay, I'm already way past where this should have happened. It's obviously not covered in the book. There's something in here. Verena and Flood were both roped into the sessions to produce the soundtrack. This is for Natural Born Killers. As was Charlie Clouser, who made a brief appearance on The Downward Spiral, but was to play an important part in Nine Inch Nails, both as a collaborator and as a member of the touring band. A former member of White Zombie, Clouser had quit and relocated to LA, playing sessions, mostly TV music and adverts. So I first heard of Charlie Clouser when he started working with Nine Inch Nails, or when he started working with White Zombie. It was my favorite band in the whole universe. Probably still could count as my favorite band in the whole universe if you just count those 2 good albums that they did, in my opinion. And it was kind of I read about it in a couple of different magazines, like, oh, this time around, White Zombie is doing some more industrial sounding things in the studio with a guy named Charlie Clouser helping them out. He has worked with Nine Inch Nails and Trent Reznor. So it was the opposite when I read it at the time. And he collaborated with Rob Zombie on his solo albums and stuff too. It was just more like, this is the electronic dude. He's going to come into our heavy metal band and make us sound more electronic because Rob's got ideas that go beyond the guitar, bass, and drums thing. And yeah, wouldn't you know it, that band broke up soon afterwards. And Rob had a very successful solo career afterwards. As a guitarist, of course, I have to align with my hero, Jay Younger. He's got the same name as me after all. So whatever Jay Younger thinks is right, as far as I'm concerned. But Rob Zombie is kind of, he's my Elvis. You know, he's a great song and dance man, amazing performer and entertainer, best in his genre. And he's made a couple of movies worth watching over and over again that I love. Most of the later stuff is not as good, just like Elvis. There we go. Said my piece. I guess all that was me being petty and saying, here's the best book on Nine Inch Nails I found, and I think he's got the facts wrong about this particular collaboration. Because I know so little about the history of Nine Inch Nails that there's very few facts that I can go, I call shenanigans, bucko. So here's the Al Jourgensen story. It's in chapter 8 of Al's biography, or autobiography, pardon me. This is the Beers, Steers, and Queers era of Revolting Cocks. He talks about what a pleasant album that was to make compared to Mine is a Terrible Thing to Taste, how much fun it was, how he was sort of working on his own terms and just staying up for days on end doing drugs with his two of his musical cohorts, and then handing it off to the other guys in the band to work on it for a while during the daytimes when he was asleep, when sleep finally caught up to him. And, you know, and the contributions of a couple of the vocalists that, you know, he flew in to do their parts. And they go on tour. There's a lot of wild stories about the tour and how chaotic it was, and playing, having the mentors open up for them, and blah, 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 blah. If you know enough about ministry and you want to know more, obviously check out his book. If you like them a lot, I assume you've already read it. But it says, when the Revco tour got to Cleveland, Ohio, everything and everyone was wrecked. We were in Cincinnati the night before, and I spilled a beer into the 4-track recorder we used for the backing track when we were on stage. I wrecked the thing. It was toast, and that was a big problem because pretty much the whole show was on the tapes that we played over the PA. At the time, we were basically lip-syncing the whole show like Milli Vanilli. I said to the promoter of the venue, I don't think we can do the show because our 4-track is gone. Someone said, I know someone with a 4-track, and he's a big Ministry fan. Just get him into the show, and he'll let you use his machine. So this kid named Trent came in with his 4-track, and he looked kind of skeptical. It was exactly the same 4-track we were using, so it was perfect. But he said, you're not taking my 4-track. You've already wrecked yours, and I need mine for my music. So I said, okay, I'll pay you for it. How much do you want? But he refused because it had some sentimental value for him. So I said, okay, look, you like the band. We need the 4-track. Why don't you come on the road with us and travel in our bus in exchange? And he agreed. That's how Trent Reznor became a Revolting Cocks roadie before he started Nine Inch Nails. The timeline's a bit off there, but, you know, I guess maybe he didn't, maybe he'd say, you know, yes, yeah, he wasn't performing as Nine Inch Nails at the time. He was recording Pretty Hate Machine over again. So, all right. He probably regretted it because we tortured that poor kid. Maybe it hardened him to the road. I don't know. But it was his first time on tour, which is not the case. He'd played shows from out of town and stuff. But yeah, okay. First time probably on a tour bus with a band like Revolting Cocks. And we called him Mama's Boy and whipped black cat firecrackers at him all the time. We used to throw these things in his bunk to wake him up, and he'd jump around like they were poisonous snakes in his bed. He'd try to keep up with our drinking. We wouldn't let him stop, so he'd puke and pass out. And then we'd draw dicks and pussies and the word fag on him in permanent Sharpie marker. Eventually, he got sick of the abuse and said, oh, my grandmother's sick. I have to go. And he left the tour. But we kept the 4-track. Looking back, I really think going out with Revco was good for Trent. It was a trial by fire. No frying pan, directly into the fire. He earned his stripes. If you can survive a Revolting Cocks tour, you can survive the music business. I didn't see him again for a number of years. Then out of the blue, he called me up and asked me to produce a cover of Queen's Get Down, Make Love for a Pretty Hate Machine B-side. I don't know why he came back to me after we put him through so much crap, but I was happy to hear from him again, so I invited him to Chicago Tracks, which is the recording studio for all the Wax Tracks, artists, where we put him through another few days of hell, and I really liked the guy. We were just fucking with him, which is what we did back then with people we liked. We had a pact during the session that we would work all hours of the night and no one could fall asleep. Anyone who fell asleep would get their head shaved. And then, of course, I put Rofenols in Trent's and drummer Chris Verena's drinks so they passed out. It was kind of like a Vegas game there, man. I was tilting the odds, doing lots of coke to stay awake and giving them drugs to make sure they passed out. As soon as they fell asleep, I broke out the clippers, shaved their heads and their eyebrows. I got through Verena really fast, and then I started on Trent. Shaving his head was no problem, and I did one of the eyebrows completely, but only got halfway through the other one before he woke up. He asked, "What the fuck are you doing?" And I said, "I told you, man, no one's allowed to pass out." He didn't know what I did exactly, so he ran to the mirror, saw what I did to him, and started screaming like an 8-year-old girl. The next month, I saw a photo of him in some music magazine, and the caption read, "Trent sets a new style. Ha!" It neglected to mention the part about him passing out from Rohypnol and me butchering his hair. That's the new style. But seriously, I think Trent is really talented, and I have no problems with his success. I'm happy for the guy. All right. Thanks for clarifying that you don't begrudge him his success. I don't know where that came from. I think maybe there's a bad edit there. I think whoever edited this should have at least filled in the context for why he should resent Trent or why people might think he did, perhaps, or just remove that last comment because all by itself it's just a fart in the wind. Sorry, I realize I mispronounced Rohypnol the first time as Rofinol. Someone please start a YouTube channel that just does a running tally of things that I mispronounce. That's the kind of fame on success that I want, God damn it. By the way, if anyone ever does collect these episodes and feels like putting together compilations and putting them on YouTube, I'm not going to have a problem with it as long as you give me credit and a link back to the podcast, maybe. That'd be nice. If anyone does enjoy this shit and wants to clip some things together. It's a wild fantasy of mine, I know. Because I guarantee anyone who does it probably already has a bigger following on YouTube than I ever will. But you have my permission. As long as there's credit and a link, please. And as long as it's like edited. Like it's not just a beginning to end, here's full episodes. What am I going to do about it, even if I don't like what someone does with my content? What do I have, lawyers? Like some kind of fat cat? Hell no. Please exploit me. And just to put a bow on the Al Jourgensen stuff, because it's fresh in my mind, I was just recording some stuff for the Guns N' Roses Deadpool episode and reading the account of a certain fisticuffs altercation at the MTV Awards with Izzy Stradlin. Now, I was saying that, when every story you tell in your memoirs always has you, the innocent victim, or the badass that comes out on top no matter what, the reader gets pretty, suspicious after a while. And I've read through Al Jourgensen's book at least 1.5 times. Once all the way through for pleasure, and then the second time, I've just bits and pieces here and there to pull for like live reads on YouTube or stuff I wanted to reference later in episodes of this podcast. And he's the same. He's just like Vince Neil. Now, I prefer his music to Vince Neil's music, I guess, overall, but it's still very indicative of just like macho frat guy mindset in someone who's made a career of decades-long drug and alcohol use. They're never wrong. They're always, attacked by others for no reason. Like a drunk person being ejected from a comedy club for doing nothing wrong, just laughing. That was it. They weren't heckling. They weren't, knocking shit over. They'll never know why, which is always strange because they didn't kick out all the rest of the crowd for doing nothing wrong. Just you. But yeah, everyone that like comes at Al Jourgensen in his stories is like totally unreasonable and unprovoked. And then he's a badass, and everyone that he messes with is a total, like Trent Reznor sounding like an 8-year-old girl. That kind of stuff. There's a lot of that. Okay, back to Joy Division. Let's talk about their new singer. Some details about Ian Curtis. It was after their first appearance on the show So It Goes, hosted by Tony Wilson, as previously mentioned. They made their debut on TV performing a song called Shadow Play. They got a gig after this on the 27th of December in London, a place called the Hope and Anchor, and they were told they were opening for The Cure, evidently, and that did not turn out to be the case. They played to about like 24 people, and then made the drive back home to Manchester, and this is where the band witnessed Ian Curtis having his first severe epileptic seizure that was bad enough that, you know, they drove him to a hospital as fast as they could. He was given some pills to leave with. Now, Ian was married, had gotten married as a teenager, and I think he was soon to be a father at this point when, you know, the danger of having a severe seizure was beginning to be omnipresent enough, because it was the kind of thing that, you know, people experience after periods of intense sensory stimulation, I guess is one way to say it. I'm not a doctor, obviously, but, you know, going to play shows was bound to put a lot of fuel in that tank, I guess, you know, set you up for what was going to be inevitably another series of spasms that you couldn't control. So he and his wife settled into a routine after every single Joy Division gig, whereby, you know, they would lay together in bed waiting for him to have a seizure, and then they could go to sleep, or lay in bed together until the initial signs of the change in his breathing would start to happen. And I guess it's this involuntary change in breathing rhythm that was the sign of a potential seizure. But if it subsides from there and doesn't result in one, then they could go to sleep if it kind of calmed down after that. This is, of course, in the event, like both these, you know, this routine is just, you know, is only for the nights when he didn't immediately have a seizure after a show because of all the overstimulation. And he would write a song called She's Lost Control that was inspired both by his experiences and the experience he had at work about a year before he was diagnosed with epilepsy, where a young woman came into the unemployment offices where he was working as like a social worker for people that had disabilities and that were trying to find work. And he was sort of, you know, in the reception interview sort of process of that office. And a young woman was wearing a padded leather head, you know, like headgear, or maybe like it looks, you know, from the footage from the movie Control, it looks like there's like one of those old timey football helmets, right? Well, she had an epileptic seizure right in front of him during an interview, collapsed on the ground, and he didn't know what to do. Months later, she would stop showing up for potential work, and he assumed she had, you know, gotten a job and didn't need to come in, and eventually learned that no, she had choked to death during one of her fits. And it was that experience, you know, knowing that he could go at any moment for the same reasons, and having witnessed what her plight was first, that led him to write the song She's Lost Control. And it makes me wonder if this kind of, I don't know, I mean, the timeline isn't too clear to me as far as what kind of things going on in his personal health were, you know, the forefront of his mind when he was getting together with the band initially. But, you know, Peter Hook does say that he was a determined guy. He was a people pleaser too. He would be he could easily walk between social circles, and he would blend in and he would develop a personality that was sort of in line with yours. So he said he was much more of a gentleman than, you know, he and Bernard were. But slowly he began to act and react, you know, to women more like he and Bernard did, because they were a couple of lads, as he says. And Ian was not at first, but he sort of, you know, settled into that, like looking at girls and checking them out just like the way they were. even though he was a married guy. But he said he had three personalities he was sort of juggling, that he was obligated to juggle. He was this introspective, sensitive artist type. He was a responsible husband and soon-to-be father. And he was also, a good time guy with his buddies out there, mixing it up with crowds and entertaining people and meeting women's. And he said Ian was the one who really believed in Joy Division the most completely of all of them. They all shared a sense of determination and fuck everybody else. And, no one understands how good we are, which is what you're supposed to do at that age. But he says Ian really lived it more than they could. He had the attitude down. And, it was also an encouragement from him. He said, if you were ever downhearted, Ian was the one that would pick you up and drag you along. He said, even if you didn't want to be picked up, he's the one that would make sure nothing would stop you. Nothing could stop any of them while he was around. Now, to go back to James O'Barr and his story, once he comes out of the Marines, gets back to America, he, sort of reckons with the amount of influence in The Crow that Detroit as a city has had, and the backdrop and the setting and how it's been such an influence on him in general. He talks about how, he's got a pretty bleak view of American cities. He says they all kind of break down to the same essential ingredients. There's good parts of the town, bad parts of the town, then there's the ghetto. It's just equal in every major city in the U.S. And there was this image of Detroit as the murder capital of the world for a while. But now it's just an abandoned city. And I believe this is him talking either late 90s or early 2000. The book that it's published in came out in the year 2000. He says there's just empty skyscrapers everywhere. It just has more of a sense of sadness than danger. But he did name characters in the story after real people he knew. Some of them were his friends. Other characters' names, like I would assume most of the crime element, the antagonists, the villains, they were names that he had copied from graffiti that he had seen around town in Detroit. He used a lot of actual places, specific buildings from the town that he wanted to reference for sure. He worked at a car repair shop after he got back from the Marines, and he was taking The Crow more seriously, but didn't right away think about how he was going to sell it. Hadn't really thought past how he was going to show it to anyone else. Because he said the process of writing and drawing it was painful. I could only do it in small increments. Because I thought, it might be this cathartic experience where I was just get all these negative emotions onto paper, but a lot of the times it was like picking a scab. It was just like cutting scars for myself. He decided to take what he had, eventually pitch it, the first 40 pages he had, to whatever publishers he could sort of get the ear of, and got an overwhelmingly negative response. They didn't get it, he says, or they missed the point entirely. Or the companies that did respond, they liked the violence, but they didn't like the moody scenes. That's too gloomy. You need to take out some of these rainy scenes and put more action in it. They wanted to make it like this Death Wish with zombies type thing. Then after getting sick of working in a repair shop, he says, he needed to move on. He was really bored. He went through his whole life this way, though. He says, I would learn something until I knew everything about it, and then I would just get really totally bored and want to do something else. So at 32, he decides he wanted to do something really difficult. And I said, well, medical school, it'll be difficult. And I took the test for it. And I tested really well on it. And I got to skip a lot of the preliminary courses. And I did that for 2 years. And it's during this time that he kind of shuts down the idea of getting distribution for the book or getting it sold anywhere. And he actually, in retrospect, says it doesn't surprise him that nobody was interested at the time. Because the thing, he says, was so confusing. It didn't start at the beginning, and it had lots of flashbacks. I hadn't seen anyone doing that at the time, and now I can see why. Presenting a non-linear story in 32-page segments isn't very commercial, so it sat up on the shelf for 7 years before I showed it to Gary Reed when he was starting up Caliber Press. Now, Gary and Caliber are born out of a business called Comics Plus, which is a Detroit comic store that James O'Barr would frequent during these times. And a lot of local artists from the area that were into comic books, used to meet up there on Fridays and, hang out, check out new books, things like that. He eventually starts working for Gary and paints t-shirts for the business, I guess. And he said anything to help pay for his medical books and things. And one day Gary asked me if I had done any comic strips. And I told him I started this one a few years ago. He asked if he could see it. And I brought it in and he liked it. He asked if he could publish it. And that was basically how Caliber Comics got started. So after all these rejections, boom, out of nowhere, someone just asks him after commissioning him to do artwork for his, for his store merchandise. He has a publisher, which is great. Because, he runs out of money for medical school after those first 2 years, and the guy's got to eat. I'm sure that there's not as much money as those recruiters told us in the 80s. If you join the military after you come home, it's up to you to save a lot of that pay that you made overseas and somehow bring it home. But even that's only going to last you so long if you don't transition into some sort of military career ongoing. Now, the first issue actually sells really well for its limited distribution, which O'Barr admits was not a huge surprise to him because he knew that there had to be an audience for it somewhere. And it wasn't the 13-year-old kids, buying superhero comics. He says it was more like the 16 to 25-year-old element, the fringe element, alternative element. He says, I knew they were out there, but I just didn't know if they would find it or not. But word of mouth was really it. There was no, virtually no ads for it or anything. No promotion. And they just kind of found it. So in the first year, The Crow goes through 4 printings. Caliber Press's financial situation prevented them from printing any further issues. This, thankfully, didn't matter as much because in 1989, another publisher named Tundra acquired the rights from Caliber, and they continued on publishing in installments until 1992, when O'Barr finishes the whole story. Then they published a color issue with all 4 books titled Pain and Fear, Irony, Despair, and Death. In the last chapter, Eric Draven avenges the murder of himself and his fiancée and accomplishes his mission, finally achieving peace through this final death. But now during this Caliber Tundra era, I found some other notes that talk about the 4 issues released before it had to go on hiatus in 89. In this story, O'Barr planned to end the series with one more double-sized chapter, Death. I always saw the Crow as a fixed story, never a continuing character like in the superhero books, he said. He then turns to Kevin Eastman, one of the 2 creators of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And that's where he gets linked up with Tundra to finish the story. They have a great reputation for first-class production value, and they, as noted already, they repackage the out-of-print stuff, and they start putting them into high-quality collections. The 3rd graphic novel would contain the unpublished conclusion in the same lush format. He says, the first Tundra book came out in early 1991, and I had drawn the last 64 pages in 1990. They wanted to stagger the first 2 volumes in order to build interest for the final book, so I had a year and a half to go back and tinker with my artwork. I ended up redrawing and rewriting large chunks, pulling back on the violence, adding more flashbacks, trying to make the story more understandable and the character more sympathetic. Now, the Tundra publications become their biggest seller to date. Over 80,000 copies. And it makes a pretty big impact because there's a lot of elements in The Crow that separate it from everything else on the market at the time. I've talked to before I don't know if I've done on the podcast, but about, the impact of like the Vertigo comics that came out around this time as well. They were a little more high production, and they were created by people that had had a few years of working under their belt already, even though a lot of them had never been seen or read in America at the time. These are people from the UK. They had written for 2000 AD. They had kind of earned their stripes, making little to no money, but having pretty wide distribution for their, short stories or ongoing, what do you call it? Not trivialized, serialized stories in the pages of books like that. And a lot of these authors and artists from the UK, the first comics they read were not superhero, pre-adolescent power fantasies. So they're doing their thing, and it turns out there's a market for it over here. The Ninja Turtle guys did their own thing in the mid 80s to late 80s in black and white with the help of their friends, and grew that into a franchise. And there's others, other small publishers putting out, quirky, weird stuff that takes hold in the psyche of the American teenager and young adult at the time for being so different. The Crow doesn't have a lot of pointless violence, its violence is pretty edgy and direct, not glamorous, not funny. And O'Barr approached a lot of the visuals and the framing and the composition like, he says, like a little black and white film, and not really like a comic book series at all. The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and 1940s Hollywood noir influenced him. He says, I sort of really like that stark black and white look with the obscure camera angles. The literary and poetic references in the book, let's see, some of these I'm not going to pronounce properly. French poets like Georges Bataille, Antonin Artaud, and Arthur Rimbaud, as well as Lewis Carroll, Edgar Allan Poe, and obviously then the musical influences we talked about, the lyrics of Iggy Pop, Ian Curtis, Robert Smith. And then as far as the visual image of the crow, the symbol of the crow itself, there's always been speculation about that, why he chose that particular bird. Some people claim that was inspired by Navajo Indian legend, where the crow is the messenger who brings the soul, to their ancestors. Others speculate that it comes from Greek mythology. According to James O'Barr, the reasons for choosing the crow are basically just like, I didn't want to draw too many parallels to Edgar Allan Poe's Raven, but Poe is a minor influence on me, and I didn't want people to mistake this is like some kind of tribute to Poe. A crow is just a typical carrion bird. It wasn't anything special. I'm sure there must be a reason for it. There must have been a reason for it in the beginning, but I'm not sure why I picked the crow. Well, friends, that's going to be it for this part of the Crow story. I want to thank you for being here. I want to thank you for giving a damn about how music gets made and where the people that make it come from. I want to thank you for giving a damn about other kinds of art and how it gets made. Usually I would say movies and how they get made, but we haven't even gotten close to the movie yet. So stick with me. Next episode is going to also feature O'Barr. It's going to feature Hollywood. It's going to feature the producers, the director of the film. It's going to feature more talk about Trent Reznor, more talk about Joy Division. And until that happens, until that comes out, please take care of yourself and be good to yourself. Remember that you deserve to be loved. You deserve happiness in this life before it's over. And you deserve to be able to put time into things that help you grow. These might be things that also make other people grow. And if you can't find that happiness or that love, reach out anywhere you can. Just tell folks you need help. Easy for me to say, I know. But if you can't do that, if you can't ask for help, then just go do something that helps anybody else. Even for a minute out of your day, every day. Even a stranger. I promise it's better than the alternative. As I said earlier, there is no financial support for this that does not come from a Patreon subscription for $3 a month or any donation that might come through my PayPal. Those links are in the description, along with some reference materials that helped me out with this episode, and some links to the Suicide Prevention Lifeline and to RAIN.org. You may not need them now, but you or someone you care about may need them in the future, and it's just good to be reminded that resources like that are there. Rock and roll is the best, and so are you. It can't rain all the time. Can it?